Well, to go back a fair amount, I had my interest in the Incas developed from my study in graduate school with an eminent ethnohistorian, Tom Zuidema, Reiner Tom Zuidema, who was a Dutch ethnohistorian who had studied the Incas for many years and was interested in their social organization and in their calendar, their political system, their mythology, etc. And in the 1970s, I traveled a couple of times with him to Cusco to work with him on a particular problem that he had always been interested in, which was the Seki system of Cusco. And so the Seki system was the system for the political and the ritual and the economic organization of Cusco, of course, the capital city of the Inca Empire in Inca times. And we were told, we are informed from various of the early Spanish chroniclers who went into Peru following the great defeat by Pizarro of Atahualpa and the Incas, that the Inca city of Cusco was organized according to a system of radial lines radiating out from the Temple of the Sun in Cusco, going out in all directions, and that this was the basis of their cosmology, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
their astronomy and their ritualism and their whole calendar system. Zuidema in particular was interested in the calendar, and I became interested in the calendar as well. I had had that from an earlier interest in studying ancient civilizations of the Mediterranean primarily. And then when I started doing my doctoral dissertation field work, I studied the astronomical beliefs and ideas of people in a village about 50 or 60 kilometers from Cusco, a village called Mismenai, and I studied their astronomy. And my first book was on their astronomy and their calendar system and how they organize time and space. Um, and then I thought about that in relation to the Seki system of Cusco. And I guess at that time, from reading all the chronicles, I began to have an interest in the quipus because, in addition to the chroniclers telling us about the Seki system, they also told us about the quipus, and that the quipus were the system of recording information that the Incas had for keeping track of information that was important to them, not only about the calendar, but about all the business of the state. And the Seki system itself was first described to the Spaniards by the reading of all of the sacred places called huacas in the Seki system of Cusco. And that was read from a quipu. And so the theme of the quipu was sort of implanted in my brain from the very beginning of my own studies. And then subsequently, after I finished that study, I went to another village in the region of Cusco, on the other side of Cusco from Ichmanai. So this was the village of Pacarictambo. And Pacarictambo was said to have been the origin place of Manco Capac, where Manco Capac came out of the cave of origin with his three brothers and their four sisters, and they
Mm-hmm.
wandered around the landscape, and then they went to the top of a high mountain, Guanacauri, and there saw the Cusco Valley for the first time. And so they went down, but so I lived in that village of Pacarictambo with my wife for about 2 years,
Wow.
and studied the increasingly, like I started there studying astronomy as well, but then I realized they had a very interesting system of IUs, or these
I use yes. Mm-hmm.
IU, these kinship groups that
Yes.
were the groups, everybody in the village belonged to one of the other 10 IUs.
Mhm.
And that was the basis for how you obtained rights to land. And it
Mhm.
also determined which
You mean
rich celebrated.
back in the 70s, the Ayus were still present in this village of Pacaritambo?
Right. This was in the beginning of the 80s, actually.
Mhm.
And as far as I know, they still exist today. But
Mhm.
all through the 80s, I carried out work in Pacaritambo, and the IU system was very strong,
Mhm.
and all of public work was done through the IUs, organized by the IUs,
Mhm.
and then I became aware, of course, that the IUs were also in Cusco in the Seki
Mhm.
system. That the Seki system was organized into a number of IUs, and so it seemed that there was this connection there between social organization
Mhm.
and in this village in Cusco in the 1980s and back to
Mhm.
Inca times
Mhm.
with this Seki system. And so once again, because of this connection of the Sekis and social organization and cosmology and everything, this kind of continued to feed into my interest in the quipus, which is the Spanish chroniclers told us that all this information the Incas had about the Ayllus in Cusco was kept on quipus, and so I determined pretty soon that I should know more about the quipus. I'm just sort of going on and on. Is it
Mhm.
okay? Should I
Yes,
just?
yes. That's okay. But I want to ask you about the calendars. It's interesting for me to know what did you discover about the calendar in this town near Cusco and the astronomical view they had.
Yeah. Well, we could do a whole other period on a whole other session on that. But essentially, I in my first book, I described the constellations that were recognized in the village, most of which had never been identified and recognized before by Western astronomers and people studying the Incas and
Mhm.
people studying the Quechua-speaking people. Of course, all the people in villages around Cusco, they speak Quechua as a first language, although most also generally speak Spanish as well. But but they had a whole system of astronomy that was radically different, really, from Western astronomy. Their constellations, they had some constellations that were similar to European and Euro-American constellations, stars linked by imaginary lines, but also they had other dark shapes, especially in the Milky Way, and these were really almost unique. There are a few other places in the world where they have them, but there was a very complicated system of astronomy, and it was all really built around the Milky Way. So I came to understand that if you want to understand Quechua astronomy and if you want to understand Inca astronomy and the Inca calendar, you had to understand this whole system of organizing space and time according to the Milky Way. And so that was what I focused on in that first study. And that sort of linked with the general topic, the general theme of the calendar system, to go back to yours. We could go into all the details, but it gets very
Le-
complex to go into.
Okay, let's jump to your first years studying Khipus. What were your first thoughts? What did you discover first?
Well, what I first, um, as I was describing, that I finally realized I needed to study the quipus, and so what I did then was, well, I realized that the quipus are these knotted string devices that are made out of either camelid hair or cotton, and they many of them are dyed different colors, and they're strings made out of threads, made out of either llama or alpaca hair or cotton, and that these were the materials actually of weavers. And so I calculated that what if I was going to study the quipus, I needed to know about weaving. So I got a grant to study weaving, and I went with my family to Bolivia. These were in the years of Sendero
Oh,
Luminoso, so
difficult times. Yeah.
it was pretty dangerous to live in the countryside in Peru in those years of
Mhm.
the 1980s. So I went to Sucre, Bolivia, and worked in villages around Sucre, working with weavers, learning the Quechua language for threads and knots and colors and numbers in particular. And I also worked with a professor at a university in Sucre who came over like regularly, and we talked in Quechua and Spanish, Quechua and Spanish about Quechua numbers, the way weavers talk about numbers, the way you talk about threads and knots and colors and numbers. And so my third book was a book that was on, it was called The Social Life of Numbers. And that was where I laid out much of what I understood, at least, about Quechua weaving and numbers. And so then that set me up to really do a serious study of the quipus. And so then I started working in different collections of uh, quipus. We know now that there are about 1,050, 1,100 or so, 1,100 quipus that exist in museums around the world.
Mhm.
So I got various grants, mostly from the National Science Foundation, to study in those collections, actually working with existing quipus, and so measuring all of their physical features and noting their colors and photographing them, etc. This was following up from earlier work that had been done by people who had studied the quipus
Mm. Yeah,
in
shares maybe.
right in Peru. For example, the famous student of the quipus was Radicati de Promeglio,
Mhm.
who studied the quipus and wrote articles and books about them. And then also an American couple, Robert and Marcia Asher, or I should say Marcia and Robert Asher, because she was sort of the main character. She was a mathematician, and they were very interested in the mathematical properties of
Mhm.
quipus. And they devised a whole method for studying the physical features of quipus. And so I adopted that and made certain changes in it from features of the quipus that I noted that the Ashers and Radicati had not taken note of.
Mhm.
And so this mostly had to do with features of the making of the construction of the quipus that were essentially binary in their character. So they were that you turn a string to the right or turn a string to the left, or you
Mhm.
tie or you put a string over the main chord or under the main chord, uh, and then you tie knots in different ways as well.
Mhm.
And so it was a binary system.
Mhm.
And so the next book I wrote was a book that was called Signs of the Inca Quipu, in which I sort of laid out what I hypothesized was a system of binary coding in the quipus, about how they were encoding information in a binary system. And of course, you and I now are talking to each other on computers. You're in Peru, and I'm in the U.S., and
I'm in
we're both,
Barcelona, really.
oh, you're in Barcelona. Oh,
I'm from
okay.
Peru, but I live in Barcelona.
Okay, I'm sorry. Oh, well, even more the envy then. Yeah. But we're both working with computers, and
Mhm.
computers basically work on a binary system of information. And And that's what I argued in that book, is that the Incas seem to have had a really profound sort of basis of their mentality in
Mhm.
binarism, in dualism and binarism.
Mhm.
And so they were working the quipus, the knots and the cords of the quipus. They were working them in this very complex binary based system of information. And
Mhm.
so I laid that all out. Yeah. And then I should also mention, excuse me, did you want to ask something there?
Yeah, I want to ask you about these. How many variables are there in the Kipu that can uh, communicate something? For example, you talked about the knot that can be tied in one direction or in another direction. We can also identify numbers from 0 to 9, also colors. How many pieces of information we can get from a Kipu from your
Yeah.
view?
Well, so I concluded that there are about 7 variables that can vary in a number of ways, or they can essentially vary in binary ways. But a couple of those features have more than just 2 variables. But let's say that basically there's 7 main features. So there's the material. They can be made out of cotton or camelid, that is llama or alpaca. Uh, they can when you're making a string, you spin it, and you spin it either to the right or to the left, and so that's a second variable. And then when you tie knots, you can tie knots either to the right or to the left. Let's say that we call them S knots and Z knots, um, and you can also, you have some quipus that are tied in a base 10 decimal system, and some that are not tied in a base 10 decimal system. And then you also have color, which, of course, the colors of the rainbow are infinite. But I also included that in binarism because I had, when I was working with the weavers in Bolivia, they classified all colors in 2 big color categories. There was like the bright sort of reddish and the dark sort of bluish, and all colors fit in one or the other of those 2 categories. So I included that in my analysis as one of the binary variables of how the quipus are organized. And so I went on, laid out that hypothesis, and it's out there, and it's I will say that it's helped us considerably in terms of our study of the Kipu. We're finding increasingly that this, well, what one binarism I didn't mention is how you tie the strings onto the main chord. You either tie it what I call recto or verso. That's another binarism. And so we've now found, with really focusing on on some of those variables, those binary variables, that they seem to vary in ways that coincide with what we learn about things like social organization. So I don't know if you know, but like in a lot of Andean villages, you not only have ayllus, but you also have what are called moieties. So you'll have like in a village, you'll have like a bunch of ayllus, these clan-like groups, and some of them will belong in one group and some will belong in the other group. And usually those are hierarchically related to each other. One group is Hanan, upper, the other group is Hurin, lower. So that's a binarism. And what we're finding is that people like Sabina Hyland and John Clendaniel and Manny Medrano and a series of people working on these issues now are discovering that several of these binary features uh, coincide with recorded information from colonial times or even modern times of how villages are organized. So increasingly, what becomes clear is that Yeah, the quipus were recording information. My view now is we can get to this later.
Mhm.
Not so much that they were recording narratives like stories, like complete with subject and object and verbs, etc., but rather they were recording information about the structures of communities, the demographics of communities, things that could be described. Uh, n- Numerically or structurally, like the upper group of IUs and the lower group of IUs, or yeah, various hierarchical categories like that. And so I think now this cuts all the way to the end, all the way to the chase. But I think now if we're going to decipher the quipus, it
Mhm.
won't be in terms of now telling story, reading stories from the
Mhm.
quipus, but rather it will be interpreting structures that are embedded in the quipus, and that from those, the quipu keepers, the quipu readers, they would know what those structures referred to, and they could give an account of information, whether it was how many people lived in a village and how they were organized and how many IUs they were and how many alpacas each household had, and
Mhm.
how many bushels of corn they produced every year. Those are all the sort of nuts and bolts of uh, state record keeping that was of interest to the Incas, and so that's what I think that they were keeping track of.
Mhm. I want to ask you, what are we certain about the quipus? Like, did you discover, okay, this set of quipus means this for accounting? That do we have that knowledge? Are we certain about some numerical quipus, or we haven't got to that
That,
point yet?
that's a great question. Uh, for the most part, no, we don't have an idea, but there are some cases where we do. So we have a couple of quipus that have information, numerical information, organized in such a way that's clear they were calendars. But that's really only with two quipus. And of course, with a calendar, you can get a sense of calendrical numbers, like lots of like 29s and 30s, for instance, the number of days in a lunar month. Uh, we have one quipu that records lunar months over 2 years. And so there we can say, yeah, this is a calendrical quipu. This relates to the organization of information in time. Uh, we also know from looking at some of the early Spanish census documents, we have a sense of what general household sizes were in the Andes, just in the years and decades following the conquest. So we know in general, uh, uh, you know, if you have a household, what the average size household is, uh, how many households generally made up an IU, et cetera, et cetera. And then if then there's a sort of subset of quipus that have numbers that look very much like these census quipus, these census data rather. And then we also know, we have an idea of what kinds of tribute the Incas levied on their subject populations. And we know then also what the Spaniards were levying in the form of tribute. And we have quipus that look like that. One thing we should clarify here is this whole issue is a very big issue about dating, about time. That is the date of a quipu. In general, when you look at this sort of average quipu, we call it an Inca quipu. But in fact, the dating of any given quipu is a very difficult matter, uh, because we can radiocarbon date them, but the radiocarbon dates around the late Inca, early colonial times are very uncertain in terms of reading or calibrating the radiocarbon reading to calendar dates. So there's a big fluctuation, and it's just because of an atmospheric circumstance that existed about that time, so around 1500 AD, that the atmosphere created this unstable set of circumstances for now reading radiocarbon dates. So a lot of what we call Inca quipus may in fact be early colonial quipus. And we do know that quipu use continued on into the colonial period. So after the Spaniards came, the Incas, or the descendants of the Incas, continued to make and use quipus. They were keeping their own records. Of course, the Spaniards came in and they were writing records. They were keeping their own records, their own accounts. But the descendants of the Inca quipu keepers continued to keep their own records as well. And they also had quipus that were from before the time of the arrival of the Spaniards. And so the Spaniards became very interested in this, and they systematically called in quipu keepers from before the time of the conquest. And they had those quipu keepers read their accounts, read their quipus. And in one of these inquests, then, in any one of these inquests, you would have a translator. So the quipu keeper would be reading his quipu, probably in Quechua, maybe Aymara. It's not clear exactly what the language in his mind was, but well, no, it's clear because he was reading it in an indigenous language. Then you would have a translator there who would translate, let's say, Quechua into Spanish, and then you would have a scribe, and the scribe would write down the Spanish. And so we now have documents written in Spanish that are the direct reading of quipus. And so this is one of the finest pieces of evidence we have to give us some clues as to possibly the content of quipus and how the information was encoded and how it was recorded. So then to go back to your question about, can we have some certainty with what is recorded on any given quipu? I would say in general, for the most part, you can read a quipu cord and you might say that it records the number 142, but we generally don't know 142 of what. But when it gives numbers and sets of numbers across a whole quipu that approximate census-like numbers or tribute-like numbers, we can make a fairly strong hypothesis that this quipu is a census quipu, or that quipu is a tribute quipu. And so that's sort of the level that we're at now.
Okay, I want to ask you about these quipus that have coincidental numbers. There are in your work about 3 sets or 2 sets of quipu that have exactly the same numbers or codes in a set of 10 chords. What's your explanation for that? Could that be maybe non-numerical, or that's a number that repeats in different quipus?
Well, I think there are different issues that you're pointing to there. So one is that we do have instances of like where 2 quipus or even more will record the same numerical information. And I think basically what that is a system of something like a bookkeeping system where you have a way of checking up on the record. And so we know, for instance, earlier I mentioned Hanan and Hurin, this idea of every village being divided into two parts. And we have information that there were Hanan Kipu keepers and Hurin Kipu keepers, and they basically kept the same record, but they were checking on each other. They were making sure that the numbers were correct, that the census numbers were correct, or the tribute numbers were correct. The chronicler, the old Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, tells us that in every village uh, there were no fewer than 4 quipus, and they all contained the same information. So they were copying the information, keeping track of it. This also means that we have this circumstance that people are always very curious about, that most of the quipus we know about today were found in graves, mostly on the coast of Peru or northern Chile. And so people say, well, so, why were they burying quipus? And what happened to that information? And the answer to that is that no quipu apparently contained unique information, that there would always have been another copy of the information. So you could bury a quipu with the quipu who made it, but the information was not lost. The information was still around. Then the other issue that your question raises is some quipus that have knots made in such a way they don't seem to be recording numbers, or they're not organized in the sort of standard decimal hierarchical manner. And those are quipus that I've referred to as either non-numerical or narrative quipus. And those could have been using the standard materials and techniques of quipus, but assigning them not numerical values, but semantic values. So you and I, for instance, we could make a knotted string and you could send it to me and you could tell me that, well, this string with this many knots means this. Manco Capac, say the ancestor of the Inca lineage of the Inca kings. This means this. And so you and I now have a way to communicate. We can send that message back and forth to each other. So in the class of quipu keepers, you could have had the development of these individual or these, let's say, non-decimal ways of tying knots and of sharing a code that they devised for applying semantic values or meaning values rather than number values to things. And we think that was a part of the whole system as well, but that's not terribly well understood now. That's sort of the brass ring of quipu studies, is that when we get to the point of being able to decipher those non-numerical quipus.
Yes, because I know that most of the quipus in this database are for sure numerical, but there might be also non-numerical quipus. And I ask myself a lot, why is it so complicated if it's non-numerical? Why the Incas developed a system so complicated it's so hard to know what it means?
Well, I think if you were to present our writing to an Inca, he would say that's so complicated. How can how can it be that complicated? You have just 26 letters, but you're changing them all around, and it just doesn't make any sense. But of course, it doesn't make any sense until it does. Like, it doesn't make any sense until, and we have to go to school to learn to make it make sense. You know, we learn the letters, and then we learn the numbers, and then we begin to read. And it takes years for us to begin to read the system we have. And it was probably the same for the Incas. One of our chroniclers, Murua, tells us that the Inca administrators, that they had like a 4-year college in Cusco, like a 4-year program of instruction for the main Inca administrators. And 2 of those years were spent totally learning the quipus. So it is a complicated system, but they, just like we teach ourselves how to read this very complicated script that we write, they would have had methods for teaching people what this kind of knot means and what that kind of knot means. And then you would memorize it, presumably. You would remember that this knot of 10 or 12 or 13 turns means, say, Manco Capac. And so you have that piece of information that becomes part of your vocabulary now.
A knot may not mean a sound, but a symbol, right? Like
Right.
Manco
That's what
Capac completely.
yeah. Yeah, I would say that it's like a system like that is called a semasiographic system. It's not a phonographic system. It's not a sound. So with our letters that we write with, we know they have a given sound. You know, P's and B's and X's and Y's, etc. And then we combine them all together to make these sound units that we call words. And in a semasiographic system, you have units of meaning. So they would assign, say, a knot, not that it's writing out the name Manco Capac, but rather this sign means Manco Capac. It's like our street signs, like they aren't necessarily all written out, but rather this kind of sign, this shape of sign means stop. This shape of sign means merge traffic, or so. But they don't write that. That's what the sign the sign symbolizes. That's what it signifies. And and these are semasiographs. And that's many of the people working on this, like Frank Solomon and various other people who work very intensely on these issues, are generally of the opinion that probably some level at which they were working with a semasiographic system. But so that would be, so then you would have sort of 2 basic types of quipus. So one would be the numerical quipus that are recording the sort of nuts and bolts of the administration of the Inca state, and the other that is indicating information in this semasiographic system, indicating identities, times past, events, wars, battles, coronations, etc. And there would be a whole, presumably a whole set of signs that someone who was a quipu keeper would learn, just like we learn complicated words. We don't know those complicated words when we're in the 1st grade. Like we have to read and read and read and become familiar with them. They would have probably been the same. It would have been a very high level of very complex esoteric knowledge of these semasiographs, what they indicated. And presumably not just one thing. It would be, you know, like many of our words can have dual or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different meanings. It depends on the context of it. So that would have probably been the case as well.
How far are we from understanding a little bit more the quipus? Do you think there will be a day we can say we are certain this means Manco Capac?
Uh,
Or
that's very hard to say. I mean, that's the brass ring question. Like, when will we be able to read the quipus? I think already we're getting pretty good at reading the numerical quipus, and that's the majority of the quipus. So, like for the bulk of quipus, we can now say quite a bit about them, about their structure, about their numbers, about their colors, and then we can begin to try to sort of match that with the information we have about the Inca world, their social organization, their religion, their calendar, etc. As for this other aspect of it, the semasiographic, the meaning part, the stories, the myths, the songs, the poems, uh, I think we're probably pretty far away from there. Um, I know that there's a great interest in applying AI to the quipus to try to look for patterns that might give us some routes, some avenues into deciphering these more complex quipus. And that work is ongoing, and that we may learn something from that. The thing about the quipus is that that's what the Incas thought about their world. That's what they said about their world. That's what they believed in terms of how they had believed in terms of how their world was structured, was organized. And so the Spanish chroniclers come in and they began recording information, but that's from the European mind. And they're probably putting a European Catholic sort of spin on the information they're recording. We have to get back to the quipus to actually try to work with a source that is indigenous, that is native, that's not influenced by Spanish, it's not influenced by Europe, it's not influenced by Homer and Herodotus and that whole history of narration that was characteristic of Western Europe. This is Inca, this is Andean. So, but from what we're beginning to, I mean, from where we stand now, as I see it, is that we are at a point where we can say quite a bit about certain structural properties that were very important for them. And there are many cases where we can say that these coincide with what we know to have been the way their society was organized in ayllus and moieties and hierarchies, etc. And so the quipus are confirming a lot of that for us, and some things we don't understand, but they're kinds of data. They're indicating types of structures and forms of organization we don't necessarily understand, but they're there for us to study. And with computer studies in particular, maybe we can begin to sort of pull out some of the properties of those systems. So I think, but those are demographic matters, they're organizational matters, they're economic matters, they're about the goods that are stored in storehouses, they're about the numbers of llamas and alpacas that are kept in this village versus that village, the numbers of people who live here as opposed to there. So that we're at the point where we can begin to discern, begin to understand some level of that information. I think for the other information, reading the story of Manco Capac and the origin of the Incas, I think we're pretty far from that.
Maybe we haven't found the right quipus also, right?
Maybe as well we haven't found. We've only found what I think would be a fraction of what existed. Because, as I said, we have about 1,100, 1,050, 1,100 of these, but there must have been thousands, if not tens of thousands of them. And, so many of them have been lost, have been destroyed, have deteriorated, have disappeared. But, every year, when I first started this back in these studies back in the 80s, we knew about 400 or 500. and today we know of about 1,050 or 1,100. And so, like, we've doubled the number. So who knows, in a decade, if we double that again, that's more quipus that are out there. I am aware of one archaeologist who's just discovered about 24, 25 new quipus unknown before from an archaeological site on the south coast of Peru. In years to come, there'll be more excavations. There'll be more discoveries of quipus that are not known. So hopefully there will continue to be an interest in all this, and as new ones become available, we'll study them for their properties and then compare them to ones that we do know and that we've studied, and look at similarities and differences.
Yes, when you read the Spanish chronicles and know they are referring to quipus, like say the list of the Incas, and you try to match with the database. Well, I tried. You can say there's a list of Incas here. It's I think it's numerical.
Yeah, no, you're
I think we need still to find those Quipucamayocs, big quipus.
right.
But
And yeah, and I don't think we have identified those yet.
yes, yes,
But I mean, they may be there, but we just don't know it yet. We
yes.
just haven't understood it.
There's also a maybe false publication of the Minachinelli Quipu. There's one investigator that say that she discovered something in the Vatican library. Have you heard of?
Oh yes, oh yes, I know that very well.
And
That
what do
that
you think?
that was a notorious case in the 80s and 90s when it was claimed that there was a document, a set of documents that were written in the 1500s or so that detailed the um, how to read the quipus and gave detailed instructions for it, and that this had all come from quipu keepers, and but that became terribly controversial, and studies were done of the paper on which the documents were written, the inks that were used to do the writing. In some cases they were old, in other cases it's clearly they were not old. Very intense studies of the grammar and the vocabulary used. In some cases the documents used terms that were not in existence at the time, like the word genocide, for instance, which appears in those documents, which didn't come into existence until much later, right? And from everything I've seen and read and heard, I think they're probably not real. They're probably fraudulent. It probably was a set of documents written by some very, very bright person, graduate student, maybe, like 100 years ago or 10 years ago, and put together and put in circumstances where they could be discovered, and it created a great controversy. I have in my own studies, I've set those over to the side. I don't accept them as real. If someday somebody proves them real, that's great. That's fine. But I'm not going to be detracted by that.
No, of course. Jesus Varela, I think, was the chronicle, who is also related to Fernando Montesinos, that wrote a famous list of 100 Incas.
Exactly.
And he mentions he had some quipus from Chachapoyas where he got the information.
That's right. Right. The Montesinos is one of our most peculiar, complicated chroniclers. He gives information about the Inca dynasty that's very different from anything else given. And I personally don't know what to think of all that. I know there are people, Jan Zeminski, various people who have closely studied, and Sabina Hyland as well, who've closely studied the Montesinos document, who who were qualified to talk about that. Juan Ocio, a Peruvian scholar, has also um, made very important, number one, critiques of the Naples document material, and also of the early Peruvian chronicles. So there's a whole world to be continuously studied there. Uh, but I would just say that I think those Naples document materials, I think for myself, set them to the side. If
Mhm.
someone, if people want to focus on them and can verify, can prove that they are what they claim to be, then we can bring them into our studies. But otherwise, I think they just become a diversion,
Yes, yes,
and we just lose time with them.
I agree. But Montesinos is something challenging. It's really interesting for someone that likes to read about the Incas because
Right.
uh,
Right. And I just, by the way, I would not include Montesinos with what I just said. I mean,
mhm,
Montesinos, an early chronicler, and he gives information that I think is good. It's not like the rest of the information, but it's not fraudulent.
yes, he gives information about calendars, very interesting, like times of periods where Incas switch the the count of the days and weeks in the calendar, and also some astronomical things put. But what I want to ask is about the uh, more ancient quipus. So we have Inca quipus, colonial quipus, but we know ancient Peruvians also used the quipus, and we have some wari quipus.
We have Wari Kipus. We have about 40 or 50 Wari Kipus. And those Kipus are actually quite different from the Inca quipus. Their chords are made similar but different to the Inca quipus. Color was a very different was treated very differently in the Wari quipus as compared to the Inca quipus. Uh, we don't really know anything about. I personally don't understand what they were doing with them, but I think what we have to keep in mind is that there probably is a direct line from the Wari quipus to the Inca quipus. So the Wari quipus were almost without doubt, I would say, were the main record keeping device of the Wari state, the Wari empire, whatever you want to call it. And we don't have many of them, but we have some of them. And we know that they're all quite similar in certain respects. And um, we also know that so most of the ones that we have are from the coast, from burials from the coast. But the Wari were, of course, highland people like the Inca, and so presumably they would have been using quipus in the highlands for Wari record keeping as well. And we have some very big Wari sites in the Cusco area, like Piquillacta, like Waru. So these were sites that were occupied by Wari administrators. They probably were using quipus there. And the Incas came into Cusco, and probably when they first came in, there were descendants of some of these Wari administrators around, and I think they adopted Wari Kipu technology, Kipu knowledge from the Wari, and then they began to innovate on it. They began to change it, and it evolved and transformed from the Wari type Kipu to the Inca type Kipu. And a big difference there was that the Wari almost certainly were Aymara speakers, and the Inca in their administration, they were Quechua speakers. And so one of the things that happened in the transfer from Wari to Inca Khipus is a change in the numerical system. Wari is a base 5 number system. Quechua is a base 10 number system, and so the decimal system emerges with that transition from Wari to Inca Khipus. So a lot more information. Well, I think I've just about overstayed my time with you.
Yes, it has been a pleasure, Gary. Thank you very much for your time. I could stay longer and ask you more. And
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
thank
I
you.
enjoyed it. Thank you. Okay.